A lesson in love for dumb creatures. The love and patience which Yitzchak showed to all, and his eagerness to teach them, be they men or women, were unsurpassed. He extended his love also to four-footed creatures, to birds, and to everything of God's creation. Thus, his father, Rabbi Nissen, had implanted in him since his earliest childhood, telling him that one must love everything that God has made, and one must not harm any of his creatures, and not even hurt plants, for they too could feel pain. Rabbi Nissen had had good reason to teach his son to be merciful, for he had, like many another boy, thought nothing of throwing stones at birds, chasing cows, goats, dogs, or cats, plucking up plants, or tearing up grasses. Yitzchak Shaul especially remembered what his father had told him about a cock, which was his father's favorite. He treasured this cock so much because very early every morning it used to crow so loudly and wake him up to go to shul. He therefore looked after it himself, making sure it had had enough to eat and was kept in good condition so that nothing should affect his excellent, clear crowing. Every evening he used to bring it into the house and put it in a warm, dry place underneath the oven. Thus, he would be sure to hear its crowing and be in time to go daven. The louder the cock crowed, the more pleased was Rabbi Nissen, but not so little Yitzchak Shaul. As much as his father loved the cock, so did his young son hate it, and he delighted in persecuting the bird at every opportunity. Whenever his father was out of the way, little Yitzchak Shaul used to chase the poor cock all over the yard. He treated animals in no kindlier manner. They had a broody hen which eventually hatched her eggs, and fluffy little chickens emerged, which were a joy to behold. But the little tyrant used to pick up small stones and aim them at the chicks, making them run for their lives all over the yard. Then he thought nothing of catching flies and placing them inside a spider's web, so that he could have the pleasure of watching the struggle between the flies and the spider, until the latter finally captured its victims and swallowed them. And if he could get a dog to chase a cat, why, that was one of his special delights. But one day, unnoticed by himself, his father had come into the yard and observed his son's cruel behavior. Suddenly Yitzchak Shaul felt a heavy hand on his shoulder, and looking up, beheld his father's angry face. "So this is the way you spend your time? Ill-treating helpless creatures?" His father rebuked him sternly. "I could never imagine that a child of mine could be so cruel." The little frightened boy thought his father would surely give him a beating. He looked so angry. But this was not Rabbi Nissen's way. He was a Melamed, and everyone knows that boys can drive any teacher to losing his temper, with blows to follow. But Rabbi Nissen had never in all his experience laid a hand upon a pupil. His strap hung on the wall of the classroom, it is true, but if a pupil deserved punishment, he had only to indicate the strap on the wall and tell him what he deserved, and it was always enough for the culprit. The pupil felt he had it and resolved to make amends. Rabbi Nissen's pupils, in fact, respected their teacher and were more afraid of him than the pupils of other teachers who used the strap and enforced discipline and order by this means. Entering the house with his son, Rabbi Nissen asked him to bring the Gemara Masechta Shabbos and open it to page 125. He told him to read the Mishnah relating to the injunction to look after chickens with gentle care, lowering the basket for them to go out or come in until they were big enough and strong enough to manage it for themselves. See how the Torah thinks of everything and allows us to do something on Shabbos which otherwise we are not allowed to touch, so that the tender little chickens should not have to hurt themselves by jumping a distance beyond their capacity, Rabbi Nissen enthusiastically explained to his little son. Then in Brachas we find on page 40 that we must never sit down to a meal before first looking after the dumb creatures. For first we find the words, "I shall give grass in your fields for your animals," and later, "and you shall eat and be satisfied." Thus we see that we must first of all care for the other of God's creatures before we look after our own needs. Yet you, my son, have not only ignored this teaching, but have moreover shown a cruelty towards the poor creatures, which I could hardly have believed possible in a child of mine. You have acted murderously and in a bloodthirsty manner. Yitzchak Shaul trembled before the reproof and reproach in his father's cutting tones. He thought his father had It finished with him when, instead, he heard his father saying in a very serious tone, "You know that it is not in my nature to hit anyone, and I have never beaten you, but this time I'm going to ask you to take down the cat o' nine tails which you see hanging on the wall, and I'm going to whip you. I want you to feel the taste of real pain, so that you will better realize the pain you have inflicted upon the creatures you have so thoughtlessly persecuted." Yitzchak Shaul gravely took a chair and reached up for the strap, which he had never before seen his father use. This in itself impressed upon him the enormity of his crime. His father very gravely took it from him and told him to stretch out on the bench, face downwards. "Before I whip you," he said, "I want you to know quite clearly that the only reason I'm doing this is so that you will the better remember the pain you have inflicted upon the birds and other living creatures." These were the first and last blows that Yitzchak Shaul ever received at the hands of his father, and he accepted them without a murmur. After the whipping, Rabbi Nissen quickly went into another room without a backward glance, and a moment later Yitzchak Shaul heard his father crying deep and painful sobs escaping him, which he seemed unable to restrain. When Yitzchak Shaul heard his father sobbing, he realized that it was all his fault for having made his father do something so contrary to his nature, that is, use the cat o' nine tails, which had always seemed part of the furniture until then, and never an instrument of physical punishment. This gave the little boy more pain than the actual whipping, and he determined from that moment never again to hurt anything or anyone. He felt the pain a couple of days and walked about full of regret and shame for his misdeeds. On the third day he suddenly went up to his father, kissed his hand, and asked him, with tears in his eyes, if he would forgive him. Rabbi Nissen's eyes also filled with tears, as he said to his son tenderly, "My son, you are still a little boy, and I, your father, have to bear all your sins, which is not quite so serious. But it would be dreadful if you grew up to be an unfeeling, cruel creature." Yitzchak Shaul felt a changed boy. He was so elevated since his father's lesson that he could almost believe it was someone else who had perpetrated the sinful cruelties which had earned the culprit such a punishment. During the following days and nights he was haunted by visions of himself as he had been, chasing and persecuting the birds, dogs, cats, goats, and flies. But gone was his previous pleasure in such pastimes, imaginary and actual. Instead, these visions filled him with fear and pain, and he knew that he could never again inflict pain and be cruel. From this time onwards, Rabbi Nissen devoted special time to teaching his son Musar in addition to his regular studies. This made a tremendous impression upon the young lad. When Yitzchak Shaul was 11 years old, his father sent him to the Minsk Yeshiva. He had become such a zealous student that he had earned the nickname the Harkian Masmid, for as you know, he came from Harki. Yitzchak Shaul was most careful to follow his father's advice, not to waste time on things of no value, not to listen to gossip, nor to indulge in this common weakness itself. Rabbi Nissen had also studied in Minsk as a youth, and thus had made friends in that city, who now took an interest in Yitzchak Shaul and kept an eye on him. One of these friends was Avram Abba, a baker, who despite his occupation was a great scholar. He used to say to Yitzchak Shaul that unless one's Torah was based upon the fear of the Lord and the love of one's fellow Jews, it was no Torah. He used to take the boy with him to discuss where there was a select gathering of scholars come to discuss service to the Almighty. It was at one of those meetings that Yitzchak Shaul made the acquaintance of Rabbi Moshe Nissen, one of the Batlanim at the Beis HaMedrash, a man of simple habits and exceptionally learned. Apart from his thorough knowledge of Gemara, he was so well versed in the Rambam that he knew it all by heart. All week he ate but the minimum of simple fare, and on Mondays and Thursdays he fasted altogether. In addition to his extensive studies, he devoted a great deal of his time to divine service. He used to pray at great length and apply himself to the study of Musar. He taught as well as studied Musar, and Yitzchak Shaul was one of his willing and admiring listeners, being greatly impressed and influenced by all he heard. The result was that Yitzchak Shaul greatly improved in character and acquired a burning love for all his fellow beings.